No, no buzz. Hajespy's book club. I read a Flannery O'Connor book. Or rather, more specifically, I read Mystery and Manners, Occasional Prose by Flannery O'Connor. A selected and edited collection. There's yeah, occasional prose. Yeah, no, that's how it's referred to throughout the front matter. Um, a, a, a concatenation, a collection of selected works, edited by Sally and Robert Fitzgerald, who are probably people who know Flannery O'Connor know about, or maybe even more people than that. I don't know. I would count myself as a person who knows Flannery O'Connor, knows about Flannery O'Connor. I don't know why I'm stumbling over her name, but it's a collection of her writing that, from the forward, is a kind of interestingly positioned as a collection of her nonfiction writing, like collected after her passing in 1964 at I think 39. Is that right? 64 is correct. Um, that was sort of an archival dive into her papers where the Fitzgeralds went through and um, found basically like a bunch of her typed up like talks, and included in obviously many things that were like published in magazines and stuff like that. And we're just like, there's a million, like every version of her talk is slightly different, even though they're basically the same talk, and the anecdotes sort of span across the same talks and are like slightly revised per talk because of time and audience and etc etc. And so they were just like, we decided on a selection, we thought about doing just like omnibus edition of every Flannery O'Connor uh, you know essay, everything she's ever written, and it seemed like it wouldn't work. And then we were like, well, what if it's just published stuff, and that wouldn't really be an interesting collection. And so they landed on whatever Mystery and Manners is, which is like a interesting thing in many ways. The I read A Good Man Is Hard to Find for the first time, what, a year ago, maybe less, something around there, and I read the collection A Good Man Is Hard to Find, not just the story, although all of the stories were new to me. I had known her name for a million years, and I found the stories mixed, but when they worked extremely well. Um, and I guess that's like kind of true of Mystery and Manners. I think there's like some really, really interesting essays here. I think the biggest takeaway for me is the thing I'm going to talk about after I read the second quote that I have prepared. I'm doing a thing I've basically never done on one of these, and I'm reading off my phone. Because I went to go take notes on this because it's been like, I don't know how long it's been. How long have I been wearing this shirt? It's been a little bit since I read this book, and so I went through and I went to go to a park to take some notes on it, and I brought everything, including my notebook that I usually write stuff in for this when I'm gonna talk about something that has been a minute since I read, and I forgot a pen. I forgot a pen. So yeah, from the notes. Yeah, the essay that got me. Let me just read from the table of contents. So the first essay and the whole first part of this book is King of the Birds, which is her essay about raising peacocks, which I think is fantastic. It's extremely worth reading. It's got like the most Flannery O'Connor sentence I've ever read in it. It is not anything I'm going to talk about in this. And then we have The Fiction Writer and His Country, which was like, oh, interesting. Some Aspects of the Grotesque in Southern Fiction is the second essay in part two, so the third essay overall, which when I read that, and I was like, I actually would really love to know her thoughts about that. And I think I have one quote from here on that I'll maybe talk about a little more. The regional writer, the nature and aim of fiction, writing short stories on her own work, the teaching of literature, total effect in the 8th grade, the church and the fiction writer, novelist and believer, Catholic novelists and their readers, the Catholic novelist in the Protestant South, and then part 6, because those were parts 2 through 5, an introduction to a memoir of Mary Ann. I didn't take any notes on that introduction to Memoir of Mary Ann, so I'll just kind of say it's a really interesting thing. I think I looked into it, and it was definitely a book that was published, I want to say. I think it was extremely out of print, would be my vague memory. But a Memoir of Mary Ann, I think, is a memoir of a young girl who was admitted to I want to say leukemia or general cancer sort of ward that was run by Catholic nuns. That the nuns, after her passing, approached Flannery O'Connor to like write her memoir, and Flannery O'Connor's response was, "You knew her, write it." Assuming that would be the end of the conversation, and then they actually wrote it. And she has a lot of she has a lot of things to say about it that I think is sort of the big takeaway from this collection for me, is that Flannery O'Connor had very specific thoughts about her work and the work of people around her. She was very, let's say, opinionated, and I think that sort of tracks with what I've read of her short stories. Again, I've never read one of her novels or anything like that. It seems like I might at some point, just because every time I touch her work, I feel like I get something out of it, at least so far. So, at some point we'll see with a novel, one or the other. But yeah, let's get into some close readings. So this one is from The Fiction Writer and His Country, and I'm going to read one paragraph. At least, however, we are all known to be anguished. The writers of the editorial in question suggest that our anguish is a result of our isolation from the rest of the country. I feel that this would be news to most Southern writers. The anguish that most of us have observed for some time now has been caused not by the fact that the South is alienated from the rest of the country, but by the fact that it is not alienated enough. That every day we are getting more and more like the rest of the country. That we are being forced out not only of our many sins, but of our few virtues. This may be unholy anguish, but it is anguish nevertheless. This is, again, she passed in 1964 at the age of 39, so this is somewhere in the, late 40s through the 50s. I didn't look up the specific copyright dates of these essays, but it is a very clear thing that she is speaking about when she says our many sins and our few virtues. Or at least I like to think that she is not including in the South's few virtues slavery. Or I guess Jim Crow specifically. I think it is perhaps optimistic of me to say that is covered in the many sins. Again, past 1964, so like burgeoning civil rights. And it's been going since, oh, well, since, well, um, and I say that because she is speaking often of the question of manners, that I think is covered, the is what she is covering by the few virtues, the sense of having, what I would, in my parlance at least, refer to as sort of like communal standards, or sort of understood ways of interacting with one another. And I think she's also covering like just simply things like shared dialects, like a particular language of respect. And she is 1,000,000% only talking about white people here. Uh, but I found that passage really sort of illuminating, because I think it hits a thing that she hits over and over in this, which is, on some level, the more annoying thing about this collection of nonfiction. Because as much as the sort of editors say in the foreword that they have done a bunch of work to stop repetition, or not simply publish everything she's ever written. She hits the same points over and over and over in this, and on the flip side of that, that is why I say I think she has thought very thoroughly about her own work and her own place, sort of in the discursive community, and other people's as well, including when she just roasts some students. That's pretty funny. Yeah, I think that's what I needed to say about that. So we're on to page 40. This is the quote from The Grotesque in Southern Fiction. And this is, I think, as much as I was excited by the title of The Grotesque in Southern Fiction when I sort of first saw this book, and then ended up really not liking the essay, I do think this sort of section is the central argument that kind of is the one that gets repeated over and over. So, it's a bit long. All novelists are fundamentally seekers and describers of the real. But the realism of each novelist will depend on his view of the ultimate reaches of But the realism of each novelist will depend on his view of the ultimate reaches of reality. Since the 18th century, the popular spirit of each succeeding age has tended more and more to the view that the ills and mysteries of life will eventually fall before the scientific advances of man. A belief that is still going strong, even though this is the first generation to face total extinction because of these advances. Which, dropping the atomic bomb in there is like pretty damn. If the novelist is in tune with this spirit, if he believes that actions are predetermined by psychic makeup or the economic situation or some other determinable factor, then he will be concerned above all with an accurate reproduction of the things that most immediately concern man, with the natural forces that he feels control his destiny. Such a writer may produce a great tragic naturalism, for by his responsibility to the things he sees, he may transcend the limitations of his narrow vision, that's the kindest version of this argument she makes across this whole book, I think. On the other hand, if the writer believes that our life is and will remain essentially mysterious, if he looks upon us as beings existing in a created order to whose laws we freely respond, then what he sees on the surface will be of interest to him only as he can go through it into an experience of mystery itself. His kind of fiction will always be pushing its own limits, outward toward the limits of mystery, because for this kind of writer, the meaning of a story does not begin except at a depth where adequate motivation and adequate psychology and the various determinations that have been exhausted. Such a writer will be interested in what we don't understand rather than in what we do. He will be interested in possibility rather than probability. He will be interested in characters who are forced out to meet evil and grace, and who act on a trust beyond themselves, whether they know very clearly what it is they act upon or not. To the modern mind, this kind of character and his creator are typical Don Quixotes, tilting it was not there. I would not like to suggest that this kind of writer, because his interest is predominantly in mystery, is able in any sense to slight the concrete. Fiction begins where human knowledge begins, with the senses, and every fiction writer is bound by this fundamental aspect of his medium. I do believe, however, that the kind of writer I am describing will use the concrete in a more drastic way. His way will much more obviously be the way of distortion. Henry James said that Conrad in his fiction did things in the way that took the most doing. I think the writer of grotesque fiction does them in the way that takes the least, because in his work, distances are so great. That was an interesting line to read. Because in his work, distances are so great. It's an emphasis on the amount of distances, not on the quality of distances. He's looking for one image that will connect or combine or embody 2 points. One is a point in the concrete, and the other is a point not visible to the naked eye, but believed in by him firmly, just as real to him really as the one that everybody sees. It's not necessary to point out that the look of this fiction is going to be wild, and that it is almost of necessity going to be violent and comic, because of the discrepancies that it seeks to combine. There's so much happening in this passage, and like I'm such a poor reader, trapped here as I am. Even though the writer who produces grotesque fiction may not consider his characters any more freakish than an ordinarily even though the writer who produces grotesque fiction may not consider his characters any more freakish than an ordinary fallen man usually is, his audience is going to, and it is going to ask him, or, more often, tell him why he has chosen to bring such maimed souls alive. Thomas Mann has said that the grotesque is the true anti-bourgeois style, but I believe that in this country, the general reader has managed to connect the grotesque with the sentimental, for whenever he speaks of it favorably, he seems to associate it with the writer's compassion. It is considered an absolute necessity these days for writers to have compassion. Compassion is a word that sounds good in anybody's mouth, and which no book jacket can do without. It is a quality which no one can put his finger on in the exact critical sense, so it is always safe for anybody to use. Usually, I think what is meant by it is that the writer excuses all human weakness because human weakness is human. The kind of hazy compassion demanded of the writer now makes it difficult for him to be anti-anything. Certainly when the grotesque is used in a legitimate way, the intellectual and moral judgments implicit in it will have the ascendancy over feeling. So yeah, it's a million things happening in there. I think they kind of cover everything in this book, and it's a good thing that this is a Just Bees book club, because that means I don't have to like talk through every bit of it, because only bees are here. But to talk through a little bit of it, one of the things that's interesting here is the grotesque is coded here in such a way to make me think that it was like a very, if not useful, at least prevalent term that like O'Connor felt a need to push back against. It was of the mode at the time or something like that, because the more she talks about the grotesque, the more I'm like, I have no idea what you're describing. Like I have some general like snippets here and there. There's examples that she gives, but like it feels like it was such an in the air sort of term that it's never bothered to be like broken down, and I'm sure I could find a secondary source that would really help me figure this out. But I was just reading this book, so which was an interesting thing because, like, she references things like the way that a good man is hard to find is just like a, in on some level just the story of a family who gets murdered, right? On other levels is a different thing for her, and we'll get a little bit more to that. Um, but when I think of grotesque, my brain immediately goes to much later things like I when I think of grotesque, I'm more inclined to think of like a body horror, maybe, right? Or even earlier things like a Lovecraft or like, but like I think there's a very specific use of the word grotesque here that um, I'm simply not historically familiar with, and that led to a lot of confusion. Um, there's like the very strong claim that fiction begins where human knowledge begins with the senses. This is a thing that is referred back to constantly. There's multiple references to the fact that fiction begins with the eye. It begins with seeing. It begins with like sight, uh, and in some ways is not reducible to it, because that's sort of the thrust of this passage that I just read is, right, like that for her good fiction is not something that is reducible. It is something that engages with the fundamental mystery of life, let's say, of faith, let's say. She sort of waffles back and forth occasionally on that, I think, but or not waffles back and forth, but has more complicated things to say about it than I am maybe capable of understanding, much less articulating. And there's also the sick fucking burn of compassion is a word that sounds good in anybody's mouth and which no book jacket can do without. Just like job and bomb. Again, sometimes it becomes clear that Flannery O'Connor is making a really deadpan joke, and that's always a fun moment. Again, because a lot of these are sort of things that were written to be given as speeches, and I have no idea what she sounds like. No idea. I've never heard her speak before. But I reading this suspect that like she knew her audience at the very least. Next passage, we get to do some close reading. I wanted to read this because she has a sort of Stephen Kingian tendency to dunk on the teaching of literature and how it works, but also she can do some close reading, and I think it's pretty good. This is from The Nature and Aim of Fiction. All the sentences in Madame Bovary could be examined with wonder, but there is one in particular that always stops me in admiration. Flaubert has just shown us Emma at the piano with Charles watching her. He says, quote, "She struck the notes with aplomb and ran from top to bottom of the keyboard without a break. Thus shaken up, the old instrument, whose strings buzzed, could be heard at the other end of the village when the window was open, and often the bailiff's clerk, passing along the high road, bareheaded and in list slippers, stopped to listen, his sheet of paper in his hand." The more you look at a sentence like that, the more you can learn from it. At one end of it, we are with Emma and this very solid instrument, quote, "whose strings buzzed," end quote. And at the other end of it, we are across the village with his very concrete clerk in his list slippers. With regard to what happens to Emma in the rest of the novel, we may think that it makes no difference. The instrument has buzzing strings, or that the clerk wears list slippers and has a piece of paper in his hand. But Flaubert had to create a believable village to put Emma in. It's always necessary to remember that the fiction writer is much less immediately concerned with grand ideas and bristling emotions than he is with putting list slippers on clerks. Um, which I think actually like dovetails directly in, because I already said like what the I just think that's a really good close reading of Flaubert. And it's, I mean, maybe it's not a good close reading of Flaubert. That's probably the wrong way to put it. It's a really good close reading that is instructive in talking about why you write things. um, I didn't think I was going to be that broad when I started that sentence. Um, but yes, the line that more interested in putting list slippers is like, yeah, I think the word believable trips me up a little bit because I'm not a person who's interested in immersion or necessarily belief, but like the broad structure of just being like, it matters where sort of the camera is, it matters where the POV is in any moment, and it matters that Flaubert in this moment pulls it way the fuck back to give you a sense of the effects of this action in the world, even though it doesn't matter to the specific story of this particular protagonist. That there are multiple levels on which you need to be writing at all moments if you want to write something that anyone cares about. And she is constantly saying like, I don't think about these things, that like she thinks that no one really thinks about these things, like the moment to moment action of writing is not defined by this fidelity or this ideological commitment or whatever, but they do need to be there because that's what makes the work a work, that's what makes the work work. And then my last little bit, I, from On Her Own Work, I don't have any pretensions to being an Aeschylus or Sophocles and providing you in this story with a cathartic experience out of your mythic background. Though the story I'm going to read certainly calls up a good deal of the South's mythic background, and it should elicit from you a degree of pity and terror, even though its way of being serious is a comic one. I do think, though, that like the Greeks, you should know what is going to happen in this story so that any element of suspense in it will be transferred from its surface to its interior. I would be most happy if you had already read it, happier still if you do it well, but since experience has taught me to keep my expectations along these lines modest, there's a laugh line. I'll tell you that this is the story of a family of 6 which, on its way driving to Florida, gets wiped out by an escaped convict who calls himself the Misfit. The family is made up of the grandmother and her son, Bailey, and his children, John Wesley and June Starr, and the baby. And there is also the cat and the children's mother. The cat is named Pity Sing, and the grandmother is taking him with them, hidden in a basket. And I was just like, finally, the pro-spoiler representation I've always needed in my life. Thanks for not watching.